The morning air carried the smell of diesel fuel and burnt coffee as Sarah Chen adjusted the straps on her supply pack for what felt like the 100th time. At 26 years old, she had been with the unit for 3 years, and in all that time, she had never fired her weapon outside of the practice range. That was fine by her. She was a logistics specialist, not a door kicker. Her job was to make sure the real fighters had what they needed when they needed it. The forward operating base in the mountainous border region had been her home for the past 4 months. Every morning started the same way. Check inventory, coordinate supply runs, manage equipment requisitions, and ensure the combat teams had their gear ready. It was repetitive work, but Sarah took pride in it. A missing magazine or a faulty radio could mean the difference between life and death out there, and she made sure those mistakes never happened on her watch. Captain Morrison walked past her station that morning, his weathered face showing the stress of another sleepless night. He was planning something big. Sarah could always tell. The way he moved, the way he talked to his team leaders in hushed tones near the operations tent. Something was coming. "Chen, got a minute?" Morrison called out, not really asking. Sarah set down the equipment checklist she had been reviewing and walked over. "Yes, sir? We're moving a team up to Observation Post Delta tomorrow at dawn. 8 men, 3-day operation. I need you to prep their supplies." He handed her a list. Standard stuff mostly. Ammunition, rations, water, medical supplies, communications equipment. Sarah scanned the list quickly. "How much ammunition, sir?" "This seems light for 3 days." Morrison's jaw tightened. "It's a surveillance operation. Eyes only. They're not supposed to engage." There was something in his voice that made Sarah pause, but she knew better than to push. "Understood, sir. I'll have everything ready by 0500. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that ammunition count. In her experience, things never went according to plan out there. The enemy didn't care about operational parameters. They didn't know when they were supposed to leave a surveillance team alone. She lay in her bunk, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of generators and radio chatter. At 3 in the morning, she got up and went back to the supply depot. The guard on duty, Private Jackson, looked surprised to see her. "Can't sleep, Sergeant?" "Something like that," Sarah replied, pulling out her access codes. She went to the ammunition storage and started pulling extra magazines. Not too many, just enough. She packed them carefully into a separate kit bag, marking it with a small notation, only she would understand. If Morrison asked, she would say it was backup contingency. If he didn't ask, the team would have extra ammunition if they needed it. She did the same with medical supplies, an extra trauma kit, additional quick-clot bandages, another tourniquet. Little things that might not matter, or might mean everything. Dawn came too quickly. The team assembled in the pre-mission briefing area. Sarah recognized most of them. Lieutenant Hayes, the team leader, was a solid officer. Calm under pressure. Smart, the kind of person who listened to his people. Sergeant Ramirez, the second in command, was more aggressive but reliable. The rest were good soldiers. Young, mostly, but trained and ready. Sarah helped them load the supplies onto their backs. She checked every piece of equipment herself, making sure straps were secure, weight was distributed properly, nothing would rattle or make noise on the move. When she got to Hayes, she quietly handed him the extra kit bag. "What's this?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Insurance," Sarah said simply. "You probably won't need it." Hayes looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thanks, Chen." The team moved out as the sun started to break over the eastern mountains. Sarah watched them disappear into the rocky terrain, their forms getting smaller until they were just dark specks against the brown and gray landscape. Then they were gone. The day passed slowly. Sarah went through her normal routines, but her mind kept drifting to that team somewhere up in the mountains. Observation Post Delta was positioned on a ridge overlooking a valley that had seen increased enemy activity in recent weeks. Intelligence suggested a supply route was running through there. The team's job was to watch, record, and report. Nothing more. By evening, the first reports came in. The team had reached the observation post without incident. They were setting up their equipment and beginning surveillance. Everything was going according to plan. Sarah should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt a growing sense of unease that she couldn't explain. She had learned to trust her instincts in this place. The mountains had a way of teaching you that some things couldn't be put into words or written in reports. Some things you just felt. She was in the communications tent when the second report came in. 8 hours into the operation, Hayes's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional. Base, this is Delta One. Multiple enemy vehicles spotted in the valley. Looks like a convoy. At least 6 trucks, possibly more. Recording and documenting as instructed. Morrison was there within seconds. Delta One. Maintain position. Continue observation. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Copy that, base. Maintaining position. Sarah listened as Hayes continued to report details. The enemy convoy was moving slowly through the valley, stopping periodically. They seemed to be setting up something. But from the ridge, it was hard to tell exactly what. The team took photographs, recorded movements, marked positions on their maps. Hours passed. Night fell. The enemy convoy remained in the valley. And now there were lights. Generators. The sound of vehicles and voices carrying up through the thin mountain air. They were establishing something more permanent than just a waypoint. Maybe a staging area. Maybe a base. Sarah was supposed to go off duty at 2200 hours. But she stayed in the communications tent. Morrison didn't send her away. He knew what it was like when you had people out there. Sleep didn't come easy regardless of what the duty roster said. At 0230, everything changed. Base, this is Delta One. Hayes's voice came through the radio. And this time, there was tension in it. We have a situation. Enemy patrol moving up the ridge. They're heading directly toward our position. Morrison grabbed the radio handset. Delta One, how many? Counting at least 15, possibly 20. They're spread out. Moving tactically. Base, I think they know we're here. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Somehow, the enemy had detected them. Maybe thermal imaging. Maybe a tip from a local informer. Maybe just bad luck. It didn't matter how. What mattered was that 8 men were about to face 3 times their number on a rocky ridge in the middle of the night. Delta One, fall back to extraction point Beta. We'll have birds in the air in 20 minutes. Negative, base. Hayes's voice was steady despite the situation. They're between us and the extraction point. We're going to have to hold position and wait them out. Morrison looked at the operations officer, who was already coordinating with aviation. 20 minutes for helicopters to spin up and fly out, then another 15 to 20 minutes to reach the ridge. The team would have to hold for at least 35 to 40 minutes, probably longer. Sarah found herself calculating ammunition in her head. Standard load, plus what she had added. Maybe enough. Maybe not. It depended on how aggressive the enemy was, how long they were willing to press an attack. The radio crackled again. Base. They're within 500 meters. Taking defensive positions. Then they heard it. The sound that every soldier dreads. Gunfire. First a few scattered shots, then building into a sustained firefight. Over the radio, they could hear Hayes shouting commands, Ramirez calling out targets, the sound of their weapons firing. Delta One, report. Morrison's knuckles were white on the handset. We're engaged, taking fire from multiple positions. Hayes's voice was barely audible over the chaos. They've got us pinned down. Morrison turned to the aviation coordinator. Where are those birds? 15 minutes out, sir. 15 minutes. Sarah thought about what could happen in 15 minutes. How many rounds could be fired? How many people could die? She stood there, feeling completely helpless. All her training, all her skills with logistics and supply management, meant nothing right now. The team was fighting for their lives, and there was nothing she could do about it. We need support up there. Morrison was on another radio now, trying to coordinate any asset that could help. Artillery was too far. Drones had no weapons payload. The helicopters were the only option, and they were still 10 minutes away. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She turned and ran from the communications tent toward the motor pool. Jackson was there, half asleep in a Humvee. "I need a vehicle," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority she didn't know she had. "Sergeant, I can't just—" "Now, Jackson." Something in her eyes made him move. He tossed her the keys to one of the smaller utility vehicles. Sarah jumped in, started the engine, and headed for the armory. She grabbed her rifle, a vest with ammunition, and a long-range scope that she had qualified on but never actually used in the field. By the time Morrison realized she was gone, Sarah was already driving out the gate, heading up the mountain road toward the ridge. The radio in her vehicle was tuned to the team frequency, and she could hear the desperate situation unfolding. The enemy had them surrounded on 3 sides. They were running low on ammunition. One man was already wounded. The road was rough, barely more than a trail, but Sarah pushed the vehicle as hard as she could. She had studied the maps. She knew the terrain. There was a position about 800 meters from where the team was pinned down, a rocky outcrop that would give her line of sight. The vehicle's engine screamed in protest as Sarah pushed it up the steep incline. Rocks pinged off the undercarriage, and more than once she felt the wheels lose traction, spinning uselessly before finding purchase again. Through the windshield, she could see the ridge silhouetted against the night sky. Somewhere up there, muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like angry fireflies. Her radio continued to broadcast the chaos. Hayes was trying to coordinate fire and movement, but his voice was getting more strained with each transmission. They were being overwhelmed by numbers and firepower. The enemy had them zeroed in, and it was only a matter of time before someone else got hit. Sarah reached the end of the vehicle-accessible trail and slammed on the brakes. She grabbed her rifle, ammunition, and a small pack with water, and her night vision device. The outcrop she had identified on the maps was still another 200 meters up, over terrain that would have to be covered on foot. She started climbing, using her hands as much as her feet, pulling herself up over boulders and loose scree that threatened to send her tumbling back down the mountainside. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The thin mountain air made every step a struggle. She had trained for this. Technically, everyone did basic infantry skills regardless of their specialty, but running obstacle courses at sea level and climbing a mountain in full gear while people were dying nearby were completely different experiences. Her legs burned. Her lungs felt like they were on fire. She kept climbing. The sounds of battle grew louder. She could distinguish individual weapons now. The sharp crack of American rifles. The deeper, rhythmic reports of enemy machine guns. The occasional explosion of a grenade. She was close, maybe too close, but there was no other position that would work. Sarah reached the outcrop and threw herself down behind the rocks, gasping for air. Her hands were shaking from exertion and adrenaline. She forced herself to take 3 deep breaths, trying to slow her heart rate, trying to steady her hands. This was nothing like the range, nothing like the controlled environment where she had qualified as an expert marksman 3 years running. She attached the scope to her rifle with practiced movements, then activated her night vision device. The world turned green and grainy, but she could see. About 800 meters away, she could make out the team's position. They had formed a defensive perimeter behind a collection of large rocks. But the enemy had them in a bad spot. Fighters were advancing from 3 directions, using fire and movement tactics that showed they knew what they were doing. Sarah scanned the battlefield, trying to make sense of the chaos. She counted at least 18 enemy fighters, possibly more hidden in the rocks and shadows. The team was returning fire, but they were being methodical about it, conserving ammunition. That told Sarah everything she needed to know. They were running low. Her radio crackled. "Base. This is Delta 1. We're at 50% ammunition. 1 wounded, stable for now. Enemy is massing for another push. If those birds don't get here in the next 5 minutes, we're not going to make it." Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Delta 1. Helicopters are 3 minutes out. Hold your position. We have an additional asset moving into position." There was a pause, then Hayes responded. "What kind of asset, base?" "When port, off." Sarah keyed her own radio, her voice surprisingly calm. Delta 1, this is Chen. I'm approximately 800 meters northeast of your position, elevated. I have eyes on the enemy. How do you want to work this? The silence that followed was heavy. She could imagine Hayes processing what she had just said. The logistics sergeant who had loaded their packs that morning was now on a ridge with a rifle, calling herself an asset. Finally, Hayes responded, and she could hear something in his voice. Not quite relief, but recognition that the situation had changed, even if only slightly. Chen, we've got heavy concentration moving up from our southwest. I count 6 fighters, maybe more. They're about to overrun our position. Can you do anything about that? Sarah swung her rifle around, finding the area Hayes had described. Through her scope, she could see them. Enemy fighters moving tactically, bounding from cover to cover, getting closer to the team's defensive perimeter. They were maybe 60 seconds from being able to throw grenades into the American position. She found the nearest one in her scope. A man crouched behind a boulder, preparing to move. Range was 783 meters, according to her rangefinder. Wind was minimal. Elevation would be tricky. She had never taken a shot at this distance outside of a training environment. Never taken a shot at a living person at any distance. Her finger touched the trigger, and she hesitated. This was real. This was someone's life ending if she made this shot. She had signed up to support soldiers, to manage supplies, to keep equipment running. Not this. Never this. Then she heard Ramirez over the radio, his voice tight with pain. Got one through the shoulder. Still in the fight. But we need those helicopters now. That decided it. Sarah exhaled slowly. Let her body relax. Felt for the natural pause between heartbeats. And squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she saw the distant figure jerk and fall. The other enemy fighters immediately went to ground, confused about where the shot had come from. That bought the team precious seconds. Target down, Sarah reported, her voice mechanical. She was already finding her next target. Another fighter, this one trying to flank around the team's left side. Range 741 meters. She adjusted for the slightly different elevation and fired again. Another hit. The enemy fighters were now fully aware they were being engaged from a different direction. But they couldn't pinpoint her location. The night, the distance, and the suppressor on her rifle made her effectively invisible to them. Sarah fell into a rhythm. Identify. Range. Adjust. Breathe. Fire. She wasn't thinking anymore. Just executing the mechanical steps she had practiced thousands of times on the range. But each shot here meant something. Each one removed a threat to the team. Each one gave them a little more time. The enemy fighters started to fall back, confused and disoriented. They had thought they were the hunters. Now they were being hunted by an unseen shooter who seemed to hit with impossible accuracy. Sarah could see their movements becoming less coordinated, more panicked. Hayes's voice came over the radio. And this time, there was definite relief in it. Chen, you just bought us some breathing room. Keep doing what you're doing. We're consolidating position. Sarah continued to scan the battlefield. The enemy was regrouping, trying to figure out their next move. She had taken down 4 fighters, wounded 2 others. The odds were still against the team, but they weren't quite so overwhelming anymore. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold. 3 enemy fighters were moving in a different direction, not toward the team, toward her position. They had worked out approximately where the shots were coming from, and they were coming to deal with her. Delta 1, I've got 3 heading my way. I'm going to be busy for a minute. Copy that, Chen. Be careful. Be careful. The words almost made her laugh. She was alone on a mountainside, about to fight off 3 trained enemy combatants, with nothing but a rifle, and whatever skills she could remember from basic training years ago. Careful seemed like an inadequate concept. The 3 fighters were good. They moved carefully, using cover, never exposing themselves for more than a second. They were about 400 meters out and closing. Sarah had to make a decision. Stay in her current position and hope she could take all three before they got to her, or fall back to a new position and try to stay ahead of them. She chose to stay. Moving would mean losing her line of sight on the team's position. It would mean abandoning them at a critical moment. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it all the way. Sarah adjusted her position, finding a spot where she had good cover, but could still see the approaches to her outcrop. The three fighters were splitting up, trying to come at her from different angles. Smart. It meant she couldn't focus on one without exposing herself to the others. The first one made a mistake. He moved too far from cover, probably thinking he was still outside her range. Sarah proved him wrong with a single shot that echoed off the rocks. The fighter went down, and the other two immediately froze, reassessing the situation. Now they knew exactly where she was. They also knew she could shoot. The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Sarah kept her rifle moving, watching both approaches, waiting for one of them to make a move. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance changed everything. The Blackhawks were inbound. The two remaining enemy fighters near Sarah's position seemed to realize their time was up. They opened fire on her position, not with aimed shots but with suppressing fire, trying to keep her head down while they withdrew. Rounds pinged off the rocks around her. Sarah pressed herself flat against the stone, feeling the impacts vibrate through her cover. She couldn't return fire without exposing herself. So she waited, counting the seconds, listening to the rhythms of their fire. When there was a pause, she popped up and sent 3 quick shots in their direction. No hits, but enough to make them reconsider their plan. The helicopters were overhead now, their door gunners opening up with devastating effect. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Tracer rounds lit up the night sky like deadly red raindrops. The enemy fighters who had been pressing the team's position broke and ran, scattering into the rocks and crevices where the helicopter guns couldn't easily reach them. Delta 1, this is Hawk 2-3. We have you visual. Prepare for extraction. Hayes responded immediately. Hawk 2-3. We have 1 wounded. Need medical assist on board. Also be advised we have a friendly approximately 800 meters northeast of our position. Sergeant Chen. She needs pickup too. Copy that, Delta 1. We'll get her second pass. Sarah watched as the first helicopter dropped into a hover near the team's position. It was a risky maneuver, hovering in a hot landing zone, but the pilots were skilled, and the door gunners kept up a steady stream of covering fire. She could see the team moving, carrying their wounded man, loading into the aircraft with the practiced speed of people who had trained for exactly this scenario. The helicopter lifted off, banking hard to the left to avoid ground fire. The second Blackhawk was already approaching Sarah's position. She stood up, slinging her rifle over her shoulder, and moved to the most open area of the outcrop. The helicopter came in fast, its skids barely touching the ground. Hands reached out and pulled her aboard. She collapsed onto the deck of the aircraft, her muscles finally giving up after the sustained exertion and adrenaline. Someone strapped her into a seat. The helicopter was already lifting off, the door gunner sending a final burst of fire at any enemy fighters foolish enough to still be in the area. Sarah looked across the cabin and saw Hayes looking at her. He was covered in dust and blood, though she couldn't tell if it was his or from the wounded man being treated by the medic. He gave her a nod of acknowledgement, and she nodded back. Words weren't necessary. They both knew what had just happened. The ride back to base took 15 minutes, though Sarah barely registered the time. She sat there, her rifle across her lap, her hands finally starting to shake now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She had just killed people. Maybe 5, maybe 6. She had saved lives too, probably 8 of them. But that didn't change what she had done. The helicopter touched down at the base, and suddenly there were people everywhere. Medical personnel rushed to take the wounded man. Morrison was there, his face a mixture of relief and anger. The team was quickly surrounded by others from the unit, everyone wanting to know what had happened. Sarah just sat in the helicopter for a moment, not quite ready to face whatever came next. She had gone from logistics specialist to combat shooter in the span of a few hours, and she had no idea what that meant for her future. All she knew was that when her people had needed help, She had been able to prove the medical tent was bright and warm, a stark contrast to the cold darkness of the mountain ridge. Sarah sat on an examination table, while a medic checked her vitals and looked for injuries she didn't know she had. Adrenaline was still coursing through her system, making her hands shake and her heart race. The medic, a young corporal named Davis, kept talking to her in a calm, steady voice, probably trying to keep her grounded. Blood pressure's elevated, but that's expected. Any pain anywhere? Trouble breathing? Sarah shook her head. Physically, she was fine. A few scrapes from the climb, some bruising that would show up tomorrow. Nothing serious. It was everything else that felt damaged. She kept seeing the scope picture in her mind. The crosshairs settling on a target. The moment of decision. The recoil. The fall. Captain Morrison entered the tent, and the medic quickly finished his examination. "She's good to go, sir. Nothing that won't heal on its own." Morrison nodded curtly. "Chen, with me." Sarah followed him out into the night. Instead of heading to the operations center, he led her to a quiet spot near the perimeter, away from the activity and lights. They stood there in silence for a long moment, looking out at the dark mountains where, just an hour ago, everything had been chaos and gunfire. "That was the dumbest thing I've ever seen a soldier do," Morrison finally said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You took a vehicle without authorization. You left your post without orders. You inserted yourself into a combat situation for which you were neither trained nor equipped." Sarah waited. There was clearly more coming. "It was also," Morrison continued, his tone shifting slightly, "probably the only reason those 8 men are alive right now. The helicopters would have arrived too late. Hayes's team was maybe 2 minutes from being overrun when you engaged. Your shots disrupted their attack pattern, bought them time, and changed the tactical situation enough that the enemy lost their advantage." He turned to look at her directly. "You saved lives tonight, Chen. But you also put yourself at incredible risk. I need to understand why. Why would a logistics specialist with no combat experience do something like this?" Sarah thought about how to answer. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure herself. Acting on instinct, moving without thinking it through, that wasn't like her. She was methodical, careful, someone who planned and prepared. But tonight, something had overridden all of that. "They had the supplies I packed," she said finally. "I checked every piece of their equipment. I added extra ammunition because something told me they might need it. When they got in trouble, I couldn't just sit there knowing I might be able to help. Sir, I know it was against protocol. I know I could have been killed or captured. But I also knew that ridge, and I knew I could make the shot if I could get to the right position." Morrison studied her face in the dim light. "You knew you could make the shot? Chen, you're a logistics specialist. When was the last time you fired your rifle outside of annual qualification?" 6 weeks ago, sir. I go to the range twice a month. I shoot long distance recreationally. I qualified expert marksman every year since I enlisted. The range is not combat." "No, sir, it's not. But tonight it was close enough." Morrison sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I should write you up for a dozen violations. Instead, I'm going to have to write you up for a commendation. Hayes is already talking about putting you in for a medal. The whole team wants to buy you drinks for the next year." Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "I don't need a medal, sir. I just needed them to make it back." "Well, they did make it back. Ramirez is going to need surgery on that shoulder. But he'll recover. Everyone else has cuts and bruises. Nothing serious. You bought them the time they needed, Chen. That matters." They stood in silence for another moment before Morrison spoke again. "Get some sleep if you can. We'll debrief this properly in the morning. And Chen, whatever happens next, whatever comes from this, you showed a lot of courage tonight. Not everyone can do what you did." Sleep, as it turned out, was impossible. Sarah lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every moment of the night. Every shot, every decision, the faces she had seen through her scope in the moment before she pulled the trigger. She had taken lives tonight. That was a weight that didn't disappear just because it was justified or necessary. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went to the mess hall. She wasn't surprised to find Lieutenant Hayes there, holding a cup of coffee and staring at nothing. His arm was bandaged where shrapnel had caught him, and he had the 1,000-yard stare that came from being in a fight for your life. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah asked. Hayes looked up, and something in his expression softened. "Please. I was hoping to run into you." They sat in silence for a while, two people processing the same traumatic event from different perspectives. Finally, Hayes spoke. "I've been in this job for 6 years. I've seen a lot of firefights, a lot of close calls. Tonight was different. Tonight I really thought we weren't going to make it. We were down to maybe 30 rounds per man, enemy was closing in, and I was trying to figure out how to make our last stand count for something." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "Then you showed up." "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted. "I got halfway to the gate and thought about turning back. This wasn't my job. I had no business being up there. But you went anyway. Why?" Sarah considered the question. "Because someone had to. And I was the only one who could get there in time." Hayes nodded slowly. "You know what the crazy thing is? You're not infantry. You haven't been through sniper school or advanced combat training. You're just someone who happens to shoot well and made a choice to act. And that choice saved 8 lives. My life." He met her eyes. "Thank you doesn't really cover it. But thank you. You would have done the same for me. Maybe. But I'm trained for it. It's what I signed up for. You signed up to manage supplies and keep equipment running. Turns out keeping people alive is the same job, just different methods." Hayes smiled at that. The first genuine smile she had seen from him. "I guess you're right. Morrison told me he's putting you in for a Bronze Star with Valor." I endorsed it. So did everyone else on the team. Sarah felt uncomfortable with that. "I don't need recognition. I just did what needed to be done. That's exactly why you deserve it. You didn't do it for glory or recognition. You did it because people needed help." He stood up, wincing slightly from his injuries. "Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Everyone's going to want to hear the story." The next few days were surreal. Word spread quickly through the base about what had happened on the ridge. Sarah found herself the subject of conversations she wasn't part of, the focus of attention she didn't want. Other soldiers looked at her differently now, some with respect, some with curiosity, some with a kind of awe that made her deeply uncomfortable. The formal debriefing took 6 hours. She had to explain every decision, every shot, every moment of that night. Intelligence officers wanted details about enemy movements and tactics. Operations officers wanted to understand her thought process. Medical personnel wanted to assess her psychological state. Through it all, Sarah remained calm and factual. She reported what she had done without embellishment or self-aggrandizement. These were the facts of the mission. These were the actions she had taken. These were the results. Let others draw conclusions about what it meant. The investigation into her unauthorized departure from base was quietly dropped. Morrison made it clear that, given the circumstances and outcome, no charges would be filed. Instead, the focus shifted to questions about training protocols and rapid response procedures. If one logistics specialist could make such a difference, what did that say about how they were utilizing their personnel? Ramirez came to find her about a week after the incident. His shoulder was in a sling, but he was mobile and in good spirits. "Chen, got a minute?" Sarah looked up from the inventory report she was working on. Some things never changed. Supplies still needed to be tracked and managed, regardless of what had happened on a ridge a week ago. "Sure, Sergeant. How's the shoulder?" "Hurts like hell, but the docs say I'll have full mobility back in a few months. Better than the alternative." He sat down across from her. "Look, I wanted to talk to you about something. The team, we've been discussing it. And we want to put together a fund. Get you something. A gift. As a thank you. That's not necessary. Maybe not necessary. But we want to do it anyway. You saved our lives, Chen. That's worth more than any gift we could give. But we want to do something. Sarah thought about it. If you really want to do something, make a donation to the fund for military families. The one that helps kids whose parents were killed in action. That would mean more to me than anything else. Ramirez looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. You're something else. You know that? Most people would want the recognition, the thanks, the reward. You just want to help more people. I'm a logistics specialist. Helping people is my job. You're more than that now. Whether you want to be or not. He was right, of course. The incident on the ridge had changed how people saw her. But more importantly, it had changed how she saw herself. She was still a logistics specialist. She still loved the detail work, the planning, the satisfaction of getting the right supplies to the right people at the right time. But now she also knew that when push came to shove, when lives were on the line, she could step up and fight. 3 weeks later, there was a ceremony. The whole unit assembled. Sarah stood in front of them, feeling exposed and uncomfortable, while Morrison read the citation for the Bronze Star with valor. The words talked about courage under fire, decisive action in the face of overwhelming odds, personal disregard for safety in order to save fellow soldiers. It all felt surreal, like he was describing someone else. When Morrison pinned the medal to her uniform, the entire unit applauded. Hayes and his team were front and center, and she could see the genuine gratitude in their eyes. These were men who knew what she had done, who had been there, who had survived because of her actions. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering. People wanted to shake her hand, to hear the story firsthand, to be part of the moment. Sarah endured it with as much grace as she could manage. But inside, she was already thinking about the next supply run, the next equipment check, the next mundane task that would make some future mission go smoothly. That evening, she found herself back at the supply depot, alone with her thoughts and her responsibilities. Private Jackson, still pulling guard duty, approached her. Congratulations on the medal, Sergeant. Thanks, Jackson. Can I ask you something? Knowing what you know now, knowing how hard it was, how dangerous it was, would you do it again? Sarah thought about the question seriously. She thought about the weight of taking lives, the fear on that mountainside, the shaking hands and racing heart, the nightmares she still had. But she also thought about Hayes and his team, about Ramirez's shoulder healing properly, about 8 families who still had their sons, brothers, fathers, husbands. Yes, she said simply. If it needed to be done, I would do it again, because that was the truth at the heart of everything. Sarah Chen had joined the military to serve, to support the mission, to help others succeed. For 3 years, that had meant managing supplies and tracking equipment. For one night, it had meant something different. But the purpose was the same: taking care of the people around her, making sure they had what they needed to survive and succeed. Months later, when she rotated back to the States, the story followed her. The logistics specialist who saved a team with a rifle. Some people wanted to make it bigger than it was, to turn her into some kind of hero or symbol. Sarah resisted that. She had done her job, just like thousands of other soldiers did their jobs every day. Some days the job was checking supplies. Other days it was something else entirely. She stayed in logistics. Despite offers to move into infantry or special operations roles, she kept her original specialty. Because someone needed to make sure the fighters had what they needed. Someone needed to manage the supplies, track the equipment, prepare the packs. That was her job. And she was good at it. But now, when she prepared supplies for a team heading out on a mission, there was a different weight to it. She knew exactly what those supplies meant, what difference they could make. She knew because she had been there. She had seen what happened when everything went wrong, and she had seen how proper preparation could make the difference between life and death. Sarah Chen was still just a logistics specialist, but she was also the person who had climbed a mountain in the dark, taken up a rifle, and made the shots that saved 8 lives. Both things were true. Both things mattered. And she carried both of them with her. Every day, in everything she did, the ridge had taught her something important. Your job title doesn't define what you're capable of. Your training doesn't limit what you can accomplish when the moment demands it. Sometimes the person who saves the day isn't the one you expect. Sometimes it's just someone who saw what needed to be done and decided to do it, regardless of the cost or the fear or the uncertainty. Sometimes it's just logistics on the ridge, until it isn't. Until it's everything. Until one bullet changes 8 lives, and the person who fired it learns that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and acting anyway because someone needs help, and you're the only one who can provide it. That was the real story. Not the medal or the ceremony or the recognition. Just one person making a choice to act when action was needed. That was what Sarah carried with her. That was what defined her now. More than any title or commendation, she was someone who, when the moment came, had stepped up. And that meant she could do it again if she had to. She hoped she wouldn't have to. But if she did, she would be ready. I'd it. That was what logistics was really about. Right? Making sure people had what they needed when they needed it. Tonight, what they had needed was someone with a rifle who could shoot straight. Eventually, she stood up and stepped out of the helicopter, her legs unsteady beneath her. The night air felt cold after the heat of combat. Someone took her rifle. Someone else guided her toward the medical tent for a checkup. She went through the motions automatically, her mind still up on that ridge, still behind that scope, still counting shots and measuring distances. She wasn't a sniper. She wasn't even infantry. She was just a logistics specialist who happened to be a decent shot on the qualification range. But she was also the only person who could reach that ridge in time to do anything. The vehicle bounced and scraped over rocks. Sarah's hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. What was she doing? This was insane. She should turn back. Let the helicopters handle it. But she kept driving, because somewhere up on that ridge, 8 men were fighting for their lives, and she had put some of the ammunition in their packs. She had checked their equipment. She had looked Lieutenant Hayes in the eye and told him it was insurance. Now it was time to see if she could be the insurance they needed.